Thank you, Andy. Thank you, everyone at the National Association of Nonpartisan Reformers. We're very, very grateful for the important work you are doing in this really important existential moment for our democracy. I wish I was coming to you with more optimistic and hopeful news, but I think, as we all know from the newspapers, this redistricting cycle has really been a partisan bloodbath for fair maps, for competitive districts. Even in many of our most competitive states, U.S. House and state legislative maps are likely frozen in place for several cycles, perhaps even another decade. When Paul Smith argued the Common Cause versus Rucho case at the U.S. Supreme Court in 2018, he warned that the failure to contain the worst excesses of this anti-democratic practice would lead to a festival of partisan gerrymandering, unlike any that the nation has ever seen. Indeed, according to multiple studies, the proposed or enacted maps in Ohio, Illinois, Wisconsin, Texas, Georgia, Maryland, New York, North Carolina, among others, are more aggressive than even the egregiously drawn maps enacted a decade ago. It is safe to say that partisan gerrymandering has never been a bigger problem. Lawmakers have entrenched themselves in power in Congress and state legislatures. The gerrymanders are intense, durable, and they are built to last for a decade. In many states, it will be extraordinarily difficult for a majority of voters to dislodge the party in power for the next decade. This is happening, of course, against the backdrop of a narrowly divided and bitterly polarized nation. There are several big factors at play and some major takeaways. Let me start there before talking about some of the individual states. Inaction by the U.S. Supreme Court has made matters worse. The Rucho decision effectively closed the doors to partisan gerrymandering claims in federal court, effectively giving lawmakers a green light and no speed limit on the advantages they can give themselves this cycle. This is also the first redistricting cycle since the Shelby County case ended the preclearance protections of the Voting Rights Act, which has allowed states like Texas, Alabama, Georgia, and others to enact maps without first winning approval of the Department of Justice, and has allowed lawmakers to reduce the political power of minority voters even in states where they are driving population growth. The lack of voting rights enforcement means it is easier to gerrymander in these states. Two, the closely divided nature of the U.S. House, only 5 seats currently separate the two parties, has made it so every district matters and has heightened the importance of redistricting. It is entirely likely that these maps alone could determine the future balance of power in the House. As a result, both parties have worked to maximize gains, protect their own seats, and dramatically reduce the number of competitive seats nationwide. 3, commissions and other reforms won by voters, almost always with overwhelming support across all party lines, have had mixed success. Citizen commissions, such as the ones in California, and by early accounts, those in Michigan and Colorado, have worked fairly well. Commissions that include politicians or political appointments have met bitter partisanship and often broken down. Partisans have worked to undercut them or hijack them where they can, such as Arizona. They have malfunctioned in Ohio and Virginia. Advisory commissions have been ignored by Utah's legislature, are likely to be ignored in New York. 4, the number of competitive seats is rapidly dwindling. In the states that have already finalized maps, the number of districts that had a competitive result in the 2020 presidential race within 5 points has tumbled from 23 all the way to 10. This matters because there are very few districts that vote for one party for president and the other for Congress. There are currently only 16 of those crossover districts remaining. When competitive districts like that disappear, party primaries among base voters become the elections that matter most. Few states have emerged from this process with fair maps that give voters the power to pick their own representatives. There are, of course, very few redistricting angels. Both parties have long histories of bad behavior. This cycle, however, Republicans have had both greater opportunity and greater willingness to draw maps to their advantage. Here are some of the states that are in the most difficult places. I'd start with Ohio, where more than 70% of voters backed a 2018 constitutional amendment demanding transparency and partisan balance on new maps. But the commission, dominated by Republican office holders, surrendered its authority to the legislature without even considering a plan. The legislature then enacted a map that will enact either 12 Republicans and 3 Democrats, or perhaps even 13 Republicans and 2 Democrats. It guarantees one side about 80% of the seats in a state that went for Donald Trump 54-46. Legislation is already underway in state court. North Carolina is a similar story, a closely divided state. Donald Trump won here with 49.9% of the vote, while a Democratic governor won narrow re-election. It was a different story on gerrymandered maps, where Democratic candidates for the U.S. House won more overall votes, yet Republicans won 8 of 13 seats. The new maps bake in a larger edge. Republicans have ensured they will win 10, often 11 of the seats now, 14 House members. Illinois, the most aggressive Democratic gerrymander to date. New York could still top this. The 2011 map was relatively responsive. Democrats won 12 of 18 seats there in 2012. Then Republicans won 2 back in 2014 in a red year. This new map, however, all but ensures Democrats of 14 of the state's 17 districts. That's a gain of 1 for the Democrats and a loss of 2 for Republicans. Illinois loses a seat through reapportionment. Democrats take that away from the GOP. Perhaps most disappointingly, one of the 2 Republican seats being erased by Democrats is the district that elected Adam Kinzinger, one of the few Republicans willing to cross party lines, for example, and support the creation of the House Commission to investigate the events of January 6th. Texas gained 2 seats in Congress due to population growth, 95% of which was driven by Latino, Black, Asian, and other minority populations. Those groups, however, lose power under these new maps. These maps also erase the state's most competitive districts. Texas is a complex and rapidly changing state. It will likely only have 1 U.S. House seat that is competitive for the next decade. These are districts that have been redrawn to maximize partisan control in a state that is rapidly changing. Utah is an interesting state where the legislature ignored the recommendations of the independent commission adopted by voters in 2018 and enacted a gerrymandered map instead. This map splits Salt Lake City into 4 pieces, erasing the 1 competitive district in the state and creating 4 essentially uncompetitive seats for the next decade. Really quickly, elsewhere in Oklahoma, lawmakers redrew the only competitive district in a similar way as Utah did, dividing Oklahoma City into 3 solid red seats. In Maryland, despite the efforts of Governor Larry Hogan's advisory commission, lawmakers appear to be going with a new version of the 7-1 Democratic gerrymander from this last decade. They could even attempt to go for an 8-0 map. We're still waiting on Democrats in New York, who are expected to override the state's commission and enact a map of their own, resulting in at least 3 potential Democratic pickups, if not more. Democrats also gerrymandered themselves. The new seat in Oregon created a 5-1 map without a single competitive seat. Republicans appear likely to do the same with the new seat in Montana, and we are waiting to see what they will do in Kansas and Kentucky, states where 1 single Democratic member remains in the delegation quite vulnerably. 2018, of course, 2020, voters attempted to rein in some of these partisan gerrymanders and to put various constraints on lawmakers. I think it's worth a quick look at how some of those commissions held up. In Missouri, of course, lawmakers managed to override those citizen efforts in 2020 and effectively undo the Clean Missouri Amendment that so resoundingly passed in 2018. In Colorado, it's so far so good. That commission has had its work approved by the state Supreme Court. It's a little early to tell in Michigan and California, states that have not yet finalized new maps. Indications are, however, that those commissions will succeed. What we've seen elsewhere, however, is that the process has really broken down under political pressure in Virginia, where maps will now be drawn by court-appointed masters, as well as in Washington state. The reforms in Ohio have not resulted in fair maps so far, but reformers will stand a better chance in state Supreme Court than they did in the legislature. what I think we have in our favor, in our side as nonpartisan reformers as we look to the next decade is that voters really do understand the dangers of gerrymandering, and that if there's one thing that still unites us, whether we are in red states, in blue states, in purple states, we all hate partisan gerrymandering. We want to see this finished. It pulls us together as Americans, this need for meaningful elections, for competitive elections, for representation that accurately reflects a community that is responsive to changes in the electorate. The fight goes on. I'm proud to be in it with all of you.